Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in if you can. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Also like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel, YouTube.com/AroundTheEmpire. Ben Norton joins us today, and we talk about the coup in Bolivia, where the recently elected president, Evo Morales, was forced to step down by military leaders and to later flee to Mexico. An extreme right-wing opposition and a fascist paramilitary then moved in to take control. Ben explains some of the groups and individuals who were involved with the coup and the support and involvement of other Latin American countries and the United States. Ben Norton is a journalist, a writer, and a filmmaker. He's the assistant editor of the Grayzone and the producer of the Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with editor Max Blumenthal. We recorded this on November 14th, 2019. Ben Norton joins us, speaking to us from New York. Hello, Ben. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Always glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So you guys at the Grayzone, you've been really busy killing it with not just this story, but you've been focused on Latin America for a while now. And as it turns out, that was a good place to be focused on, unfortunately. Today we're going to talk about a very good deep dive article that Max and Ben did a couple of days ago titled Bolivia Coup Led by Christian Fascist Paramilitary Leader and Millionaire with Foreign Support. And of course, all of this will be linked in the show notes. I don't have that much time with Ben today, so we're going to condense a lot of this. But, do go and read these things because, and it's developing. By the time we publish this, there'll be more information out. There's already another article by Jeb Sprague with a little bit more on, who exactly is involved in this and the involvement of the U.S. Regime change machine. But anyway, Ben, let's just, you do a lot here. You do not only covering the current situation, but you go pretty far back, at least to the 70s, on the history of this. And there are a lot of names and a lot of organizations, but we should probably, I'm going to leave it up to you. I'm going to do very little talking after this, but I'll just describe, our current subject is the recent coup last Sunday of Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, and he's notable for a lot of reasons. He's a former coca farmer, a trade unionist. He was president from 2006 to 2019, but he started in politics in the 1990s, and then he was kicked out of Congress, and then he came back later, and although he had run for president and came in second, but then he did finally become president in 2006. He's the first indigenous president of Bolivia. He's deeply loved by the poor indigenous population and others. He's all about land reform, redistribution of the natural gas wealth, and he basically worked to combat illiteracy, poverty, racism, sexism, and he was an enemy of imperialism. He was very vocal about it. From his Wikipedia quote, vocally criticizing neoliberalism and reducing Bolivia's dependence on the World Bank and the IMF, his administration oversaw strong economic growth while following a policy termed Evonomics, which sought to move from a liberal economic approach to a mixed economy. He's part of the pink tide that brought Bolivia into the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. He joined the Bank of the South. He's championing indigenous rights, anti-imperialism, and environmentalism. And he's the leader of a grassroots party called the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism. And he, quote-unquote, resigned after a violent coup on November 10th, just this week. So that is our focus today, but Ben is going to explain how and why this happened. And I'm going to just turn it over to you, Ben. Add whatever you think I may have missed there, and then please do share with us your research.
Absolutely. Well, that was a very good overview of who exactly Evo Morales is. As you stressed, this is the first indigenous leader in a country that is nearly two-thirds indigenous, that has traditionally been dominated by a European descendant elite. And many of these right-wing elites are those who lost some of their wealth because the natural resources of Bolivia were nationalized under the movement toward socialism government of Evo Morales. Specifically, Bolivia has significant natural gas and also lithium reserves. So we have to, of course, keep that in the back of our minds when we're having this discussion, that this is a country that is actually very rich. It's only its people that are poor because of a history of colonialism and the exploitation and simply theft of those natural resources. Like many of these progressive leaders in the so-called pink tide in Latin America, Evo Morales' idea was simply the idea preached by progressive leaders like Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, which is that our natural resources should go to benefit the majority of the population. And of course, that is famously why Mossadegh, Iran's first democratically elected prime minister, was overthrown in 1953 in a CIA-backed coup. So in many ways, this coup against Evo today, into the 21st century, mirrors historically the coups against, of course, Salvador Allende in 1973 in Chile, where the CIA, on the first September 11th attack, if you will, overthrew the democratically elected president of Chile. And I mentioned, of course, Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, also in Guatemala against Arbenz in 1954. There are many examples throughout history, even more recently, and this follows in that pattern, and we have to keep in mind that for well over 100 years, the U.S. government, the U.S. empire, has this history of targeting any government in Latin America that is insufficiently dependent on U.S. finance, on the U.S. capitalist system, and targets those countries for regime change. And, you can basically name every single country in Latin America. It was only a matter of time until Bolivia was next. And what our reporting shows is that this was a very concerted, planned coup from the very beginning and from well before the beginning, going back several months. In fact, this year, I have spent nearly 5 months in Venezuela, and when I was in Venezuela last, which was July, August, and September, I remember back in August and September hearing the beginning of, the whispers going around in Latin America. People were worried that they had heard that there was a coup being planned against Evo Morales in Bolivia.
And of course, there was an election coming up, so that, is always a risky time.
Exactly. And I was worried that they were a little paranoid. Understandably, people in Latin America, especially in a country like Venezuela, which is enduring constant coup attempts, constant sabotage, constant unconventional warfare and hybrid warfare, I was worried they were a little too pessimistic. But of course, they were right that there was a coup being planned. I didn't, frankly, this is a bit of self-criticism. I didn't think that they could carry out a coup because Evo was so popular.
Right.
He had such a mass base of support. But I think the determining factor why the coup took place successfully in Bolivia and not in a place like Venezuela is because, as you mentioned, Evo comes from a farmer background. He came from a very poor family, and he comes out of the social movements. Unlike in Venezuela, where the Chavista movement first emerged in the military.
Yeah.
So Evo never really controlled large parts of his own state. And this is one of the major contradictions of working within the confines of, this kind of conventional bourgeois democracy. In many ways, Evo was the epitome of this idea that you hear popularized now in the U.S. of democratic socialism. People always say, oh, I'm not a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist. Of course, that plays into this right-wing myth that socialism is somehow authoritarian, but Evo is the textbook example of a democratic socialist who was always elected in 3 presidential terms, who won democratic referenda to create a new constitution in 2009 that was voted on democratically by the entire population, and it got more than 61% of the vote to create this extremely progressive, very revolutionary constitution that ensures access to health care for all citizens, that ensures the rights of Mother Earth and nature, that ensures all of these things that we can only dream about in the U.S., that are being proposed by people like Bernie Sanders, but they were actually implemented and written into the Constitution of the plurinational state. And that term itself, the plurinational state, was one of the projects overseen by Evo, because Bolivia is a country that, since its independence from Spanish colonialism, even at the time of this progressive nationalism led by people like Simón Bolívar, it was still a country where the indigenous majority of the population did not really play a role in political life. And Evo Morales cemented the role of indigenous peoples and communities inside the Constitution, which recognized 36 indigenous languages, which made the Wiphala flag, the indigenous Andean flag, the dual flag of the country alongside the traditional national flag. And that was the symbol of reflecting the political inclusion of indigenous communities into the fabric of Bolivian life for the first time in history. So this is not just about the fact that he dispossessed the rich elite landowners and natural gas owners and lithium owners of the natural resources they had been exploiting and used that to fund social programs. This is also about an attempt to really recolonize Bolivia. And if you look at the rhetoric, which we can talk about, of the far-right, frankly fascist coup leaders, it's explicitly racist, explicitly anti-indigenous. And of course, these are the same people who come from families of European colonialists, or in some cases, they even come from families of recent European immigrants who fled after World War II because they were fascists and Nazi collaborators. And when the war lost, they fled to Latin America and created colonies there. So at every single stage, Evo Morales abided by democratic norms. And it's the coup mongers themselves and, of course, their sponsors in foreign capital, specifically the U.S., Colombia, and Brazil, and the Organization of American States. We can talk about all these players. They are the ones who have subverted Bolivian democracy. And right now, it looks like they're the ones who have completely destroyed Bolivian democracy.
Yeah, and the religious sectarianism, too, was shocking to me. I didn't know about this. I had heard hints of it. Like, I heard that one of the reasons why Bolsonaro was able to get into power was because of an evangelical, fundamentalist Christian movement that had started to displace the Catholic Church, which in Latin America generally was part of the resistance, long history of liberation theology and such. But this is not. This is another Catholic faction, right? An extremist, Opus Dei led Catholic faction that we're talking about here. That surprised me in what I saw in your article, and also the fact that the plan was to balkanize Bolivia. And well, that's more of a resources thing. That's what we do. That's what U.S. Western backed coups. I don't think this is just U.S. They generally like to balkanize a region, weaken it, and then steal their stuff. This is just kind of like cookie cutter here. But the thing that surprised me was not only the alarming fascist with the Nazi history thing, but the religious sectarianism aspect of it, and the fact that Camacho, who is the coup leader, you call him the coup leader, that when he showed up in the presidential palace, he brought a Bible with him, and he denounced the more indigenous. I don't know if it's a religion, more of a paganist religion or something, but they're symbolic religion, as if that. And you're saying that they paint them as like a Satanistic cult of some sort. So they're actually not only they're approaching this from several different ideological angles. Can you get into that a little bit? It's pretty scary, actually.
Absolutely. A few things. the first thing really quickly is that you're right more generally that the liberation theology movement was associated with Catholicism, absolutely. Although I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Catholic Church has also in many ways played a very dirty role in Latin America,
Right, they're
supporting.
factions.
Yeah, there are factions within the Catholic Church, and the irony is, of course, that right now there is a much more left-wing pope, and you're right that many of the forces, the literal fascist forces, that is not just an insult used, people on the left call people on the right fascist. No, they're actually fascist consciously, and I can talk about what I mean by that in a second, but you're right that they are kind of Francoist-style, Opus Dei, far-right Catholic fascists, and they probably hate the Pope, but of course, you have to mention that in many other countries in Latin America, the Catholic Church has actually helped support some of these right-wing regimes and dictatorships. As for the rhetoric, the anti-indigenous rhetoric of some of these groups, I'll take a few examples here. You mentioned Camacho, and we called him the coup leader, but it's not even just us. So Camacho, let's keep in mind, let's talk about his history for a second here. Luis Fernando Camacho he still is the leader, the president of a major opposition group in Bolivia that's called the Pro Santa Cruz Committee, or it's also known as the Santa Cruz Civic Committee. This is an organization based in Santa Cruz, which is the largest city in Bolivia. It's to the southeast of the capital, La Paz, and this is also the financial hub. It's the richest city, and it's the whitest city. It has many European immigrants and descendants of the colonialists, and it's been a base for opposition to the movement toward Socialism Party, which is the party created by Evo Morales and the social movements, many of which were indigenous, because Evo Morales comes to politics like Lula da Silva in Brazil, not because he was the scion of a political dynasty, but rather because he was a coca farmer who became a labor organizer and then eventually moved into politics. And movement towards socialism was the political arm of the social movement. So he was very much a grassroots activist who came into politics, which, as I explained earlier, is why he never really controlled the military and the police, which were these kind of independent state institutions that were playing by their own game, and they were the ones who ultimately ousted him with help from the U.S. and other foreign countries. As for Camacho, so in Santa Cruz for many years, we were talking about the attempt to Balkanize Bolivia. Now, this was one of several strategies, right? There were several attempts at destabilizing Evo, and one of the backup plans was creating what they called an autonomous region in Santa Cruz. And this is similar to the strategy used in former Yugoslavia, where NATO countries supported the Croatian secessionist movement inside former Yugoslavia, Croatia being the richest country, the richest nation within the Yugoslav Federation. This was not the struggle of the oppressed Croatian minority. It was a movement led by the elite, rich, many of whom were fascist collaborators in World War II, or their descendants. And similarly in Santa Cruz, there was a secessionist movement that after Evo Morales won his first election in 2006 was kicked into high gear. It had been around for a while, but it was a shot in the arm for that movement. And WikiLeaks cables, U.S. government cables published by WikiLeaks, by Julian Assange, who is of course now a political prisoner being tortured. But some of these cables show that the U.S. government for many years has been supporting the secessionist movement as one of the ways of trying to undermine and weaken Morales. And the most important group in that movement is this group I mentioned, the Pro Santa Cruz Committee, which is led by Camacho. Its youth wing, which is semi-independent, but is essentially its youth wing, is a group called the Youth Union of Santa Cruz. This is an explicitly fascist organization modeled on the style of the Spanish Francoist Falange. These are people in Bolivia who literally Nazi salute, and you can go to my article. This is not. I'm not misrepresenting what they're doing with their arms. You can watch the videos. They actually Nazi style salute, like Sieg Heil's saluting, and they also march frequently with their arm at their chest, which is another kind of fascist symbolism. And many of the people in this group, the youth cadre, come from families, as I mentioned, of European fascists who fled after World War II. And Camacho was previously the vice president of this youth wing of this explicitly fascist organization, which even the New York Times, in a profile in 2008, admitted is a fascist Francoist-style organization. And he was cultivated by a Croatian Bolivian oligarch named Branko Marinkovic. And we talk about him in our article. Marinkovic is one of the richest people in Bolivia. He's a dual citizen of Croatia. There are many allegations that his family members were members of the Ustasha, who were Nazi collaborators, fascists in World War II in Croatia, many of whom fled to Latin America after the defeat of the Nazi Empire. And Marinkovic has been in exile for nearly 10 years now because in 2008 he was allegedly involved in an assassination attempt against Evo Morales using several international fascist terrorists. I mean, this is all pretty well documented. Of course, Marinkovic denies this, and he denies that his family members were Nazi collaborators. But as we mentioned in our article, even some analysts at Stratfor, which is basically just a CIA cutout, their documents were leaked by WikiLeaks. Even they are skeptical, and they think that his family probably were Nazi collaborators. Marinkovic has been living in exile in where? Brazil. And he is a close ally of Jair Bolsonaro. He's also a staunch supporter of the far-right Venezuelan opposition and Leopoldo Lopez. So the two of them are the brains behind a lot of this coup. Both of them are independently very wealthy. Rather, not independently. I mean, their family members were extremely wealthy. They're both scions of rich families who, in the case of Marinkovic, his family members controlled a lot of land and agriculture. And in the case of Camacho, Luis Fernando Camacho, his family members, several of them are elites who controlled gas companies, and they lost some of their wealth when Evo Morales nationalized the gas resources. So it's a pretty stereotypical plot you have here where it's the right-wing oligarchs who are linked to international fascist organizations who are the muscle behind the coup, much in the same way as the 2014 coup in Ukraine against the elected government there. I mean, it's a very different coup. I mean, Yanukovych was not a progressive socialist anti-imperialist, but he was democratically elected, and the muscle behind that coup, similarly, were these far-right neo-fascist forces. So, you know, this is not some unique thing.
I think they understate that. They call them ultra nationalists and neo-Nazi, but I don't even think that's strong enough. I mean, these are literally Nazis.
Yeah, in the case of Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
yes.
sorry.
No, absolutely. And then explaining a little bit more about international support. So we discuss in our piece, in the first piece we published at the Grayzone about Camacho and the coup, and then we have a subsequent piece you mentioned by Jeb Sprague, which looks at how the military and police leaders of the coup, many of them were trained by the U.S. Military School of the Americas. So Jeb can, I know you said you're going to interview him. He can talk about that. I won't go into too much detail, but the U.S. government's fingerprints are all over this coup. The leaders were all trained by the U.S. military. Of course, anyone who knows what the School of the Americas is probably knows that this is a notorious training academy led by the U.S. military. It's sometimes affectionately, jokingly referred to as the School of the Assassins, because this is where numerous right-wing dictators, death squads, drug traffickers were trained by the U.S. military and are really used as these kind of proxy forces to maintain U.S. corporate control over Latin America. Well, in our piece, we also showed how there were 16 leaked recordings from before, not only before the coup, but before the presidential election on October 20th. And these leaked recordings depict opposition members in Bolivia discussing that they had a coup attempt planned, and they said they had support from the U.S. government and the Trump administration. They also specifically named 3 U.S. senators, Marco Rubio, who has the ear of Trump, of course, Ted Cruz, and also Bob Menendez. So, you know, you have this bipartisan coup-mongering alliance there. They also specifically said they had the support of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Ivan Duque, the far-right president in Colombia. And those recordings are, of course, a smoking gun, but it's not the only thing. We also discuss in our piece how Camacho, this far-right Christian fascist coup leader and oligarch, he, in the months leading up to the election, well before the coup, before the October 20th election, he was meeting with and posing for photos with leaders of Colombia, Brazil, and the far-right Venezuelan opposition. Specifically in May, Camacho went to Colombia and he met with Ivan Duque, the far-right Colombian president, and he also met with Pastrana, who's a former Colombian president, and he was there because the Bolivian opposition were trying to work with Colombia to block Evo Morales' candidacy in the upcoming October election.
Right.
And they were doing that by working with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and they were filing a petition, and Colombia was leading the campaign to try to take international action to block Evo Morales. So clearly they were plotting the coup several months before. And not just that, there's another photo of Camacho meeting with the Brazilian chancellor, the foreign minister, under Jair Bolsonaro, who is himself a far-right extremist. And Brazil immediately recognized the coup regime, which we can talk more about, and specifically the fake interim president that was installed. And then finally, the Venezuelan coup regime, led ostensibly by Juan Guaido, but in reality by the U.S. government, imposed by the U.S. government, handpicked by the U.S. government, Camacho met with Gustavo Tarre, and Tarre is the fake Venezuelan ambassador to the Organization of American States. He's never been elected. He has no actual power, but he is Juan Guaido's, the coup leader's representative to the OAS, and Camacho met with him in August. And he posted an incredible tweet that I found that had almost no retweets. I mean, no one was looking into this guy. And it's shocking how few journalists did any investigative work on who this Camacho guy is. But
Yeah.
he'd posted it all in the open. And this is another smoking gun. In this tweet in August, Camacho posts photos of him standing with Gustavo Tarre, and then behind him is a giant photo of Juan Guaido. And he says in the tweet, he thanks everyone for their international support fighting against the regime of Evo Morales. And he says, thank you, Colombia, thank you, Venezuela, meaning the coup regime, and thank you, Brazil. So it's all in the open. I mean, he was openly, publicly thanking his international sponsors, who are the ones who helped him carry out the coup.
Yeah, it is kind of out in the open. And the demonization, they've got a few instruments here of demonization, and some of them are complicated, like the fact that Evo Morales was a coca farmer and that he defends the coca agricultural business, so he's up against the war on drugs, if you will. So that is one way to frame him as an evil person. And then this thing that's new to me, the indigenous religions are painted as satanic or, godless, or however, the numerous ways these have been used over the years. So they've got that to work against him. So I think that, and of course the socialist thing, even some moderate Democrats are all in on the, oh, well, socialism ruins economies, socialism is bad, so they can use that against them. And then, of course, the complicated nature of this election. There was a thread on Twitter that was good. It really kind of boiled down what happened, because, you'll have even people, even Democrats, even some of the sort of the better progressives, are just like with Venezuela. They denounce the coup, but they go along with the fact that, oh, well, we need new democratic elections, as if Evo Morales' latest election was not legitimate, which is really the same strategy they used in Venezuela. And of course, they have numerous ways of making sure that there are ways in which it looks illegitimate, which happen in the run-up to the election. But in this case, Evo Morales was up against I don't want to spend too much time on this, Ben, but I think it's good to just get the skeleton part of it out here. That, even some decent people are saying, yeah, he was term limited, and there was a referendum, and he lost the referendum, and he still ran for reelection, and he really couldn't, even though a court ruled that, if I'm correct, ruled that term limits were against their constitution. So he never should have been term limited. Anyway, they gave him the green light. Go ahead, get reelected. He did get reelected easily, but they also have this complicated vote counting thing where they do a quick vote and then they do a full vote, and you have a rural vote that takes longer. And in the meantime, the media worked with him, with the opposition, to delegitimize this election from the start. So, you have all these. My bigger point is that they have all these ways to demonize Morales. I don't know how successful they've been. I think I see Morales getting a lot of support, but I think this is why, Ben, that they're fairly open about it. And if I remember correctly, like I lived through the Contras era, the during the Reagan years, although I really didn't understand what was going on at the time. But they weren't hiding that too much either, other than the way they got their money because Congress had outlawed it. But yeah, I think that they feel confident that they're going to be able to demonize Morales in all these ways I've just hinted at.
Yeah, several great points there. A few quick points in response. One, this attempt to portray him as some kind of drug trafficker is insane and also in some ways hilarious because, really quickly, I'll mention the so-called interim president, the fake unelected far-right coup leader who has been installed as president in Bolivia, is a far-right Christian extremist named Janine Añez Chavez, but she goes by Añez. And Añez is an explicitly racist Christian fundamentalist. The first thing she did as so-called president is she marched to the presidential palace with a giant Bible, a cartoonishly big Bible, and said the Bible is returning to the palace. And on Twitter, people found some tweets which she subsequently deleted, but they were archived, where she referred to indigenous people as satanic. And she also said, and I'm quoting her exactly, she said, "Indians don't belong in the city, go back to the countryside."
It's
So
outrageous.
explicitly racist, I mean, this kind of neo-colonial rhetoric. And, not to comment on people's personal experiences, but it says a lot. This is a Bolivian woman who dyes her hair blonde. I mean, this is a country where everyone's hair is black. Come on. So clearly there is a major element of racism and anti-indigenous chauvinism here. But beyond that, Añez is part of a much larger far-right movement that is also linked to drug trafficking. In fact, a Brazilian newspaper just published a report the day after she self-declared herself so-called president with no democratic legitimacy. And this Bolivian newspaper pointed out that her nephew was arrested in 2017 with nearly 500 kilograms of cocaine. And of course, the Brazilian far-right leader, Bolsonaro, was also caught with huge sums of cocaine in his plane, although that story was briefly reported and then conveniently swept under the rug. So meanwhile, and then, of course, the most obscene example of all is Honduras. I was in Honduras this summer for nearly 2 months in June and July on the 10th anniversary of the U.S. coup to overthrow the left-wing democratically elected president Manuel Zelaya there, which is also so similar to the coup in Bolivia. And the U.S. has propped up a right-wing unelected dictator. I mean, he says he's elected, but he steals the elections. And it's so blatant that even the Organization of American States, which is a cat's paw for the U.S., which is almost entirely, in bed with U.S. officials, which gets 2/3 of its funding from the U.S., even the OAS reluctantly admits that the elections in Honduras are the most fraudulent in the region, and they're completely fake. And in Honduras, a recent U.S. federal court sentenced the president of the country, Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother, for trafficking 200,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States, along with machine guns. And
Oh,
according to this U.S. federal court in New York, they also admitted that El Chapo Guzman, the most famous drug lord in the world from Mexico, personally gave $1 million to this U.S.-backed right-wing dictator Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras. So the U.S. props up some of the most obvious narco regimes, Colombia being another example. I mean, we could talk about it for hours.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they accuse Evo Morales of supposedly being a narco dictator. There's no evidence. It's completely false. It is just one of these lies. It's the same lie they say about Venezuela. It's one
And
of those lies
Colombia.
that the corporate media uses to demonize a country, and they don't need any evidence of it because the U.S. government claims it. So if Washington says something, it's just taken as face value to be correct. And then the
Right.
final point that you made that I want to respond to about the anti-indigenous sentiment is that what's interesting is, you pointed out that in Brazil there is this growing evangelical movement which is tied to the Bolsonaro movement, which really the most important factor behind installing Bolsonaro into power was the illegal fake coup, soft coup, the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff, who's the democratically elected president, which we now know Washington was deeply involved in. This was the Obama administration at the time, so this is very much bipartisan. And then, of course, the imprisonment of Lula da Silva on completely bogus charges, which we now know, thanks to the work of Glenn Greenwald and his colleagues, was a completely right-wing, politically motivated campaign led by Sergio Moro, who is likely a CIA asset who visited CIA headquarters when he recently came to the U.S., and he's the justice minister now under Bolsonaro. So that was the most important factor. But then the second most important factor was the evangelical movement. And these leaked recordings from Bolivia, the 16 leaked recordings from the opposition, specifically also mentions that opposition figures had the support of the Brazilian evangelical church. So I think there's a lot to uncover there. There's a history in Latin America. You can think about Guatemala, one of the most egregious examples, where in the 1980s, you mentioned the dirty wars throughout Central America. Efrain Rios Montt, who was the far-right dictator in Guatemala, the leader of the military junta, trained, supported, armed, and funded by the United States, Rios Montt carried out a campaign of literal genocide. In fact, Rios was sentenced in an international court for the crime of genocide. So this is, as blatant as it can get. He was a convicted genocide war criminal, and he was also an evangelical fundamentalist, and he portrayed the indigenous community that he committed genocide against, the Maya, as these godless hordes who are satanic, much in the same way as these kind of Opus Dei Catholic fascists in Bolivia portray them as satanic. We were talking about Pachamama. I don't really know anything about indigenous religion, but from asking a friend, I would not call them at all pagan. I think that's a misunderstood, and I think that plays into these right-wing Christian tropes. But really, Evo Morales even though he was a Christian, Evo Morales was inspired very much by this indigenous view of Pachamama as the Mother Earth spirit, and basically I kind of see it almost as like a kind of Spinoza, if people know about European philosophy, this kind of Spinoza worldview that sees the universe and Mother Earth as this all-inclusive, immanent being, and the far-right Christian forces, they portray that as essentially just godless paganism, and then use that to justify carrying out horrible atrocities against the indigenous communities, who tend to be, of course, more left-wing and more progressive. So this is really just the repeating of this kind of strategy used during the Dirty Wars in the 1980s, where the U.S. government encouraged these evangelical extremist Christian groups, which are growing throughout the region, and they encouraged them and supported them because, for the same reason that the U.S. and Britain have supported Islamist extremist groups in the Middle East and South Asia, not
Exactly.
because they share their ideology, but because they share the same enemy. And the enemy are In the case of Latin America, socialists and communists. In the case of the Middle East, socialists and Arab nationalists. So it's once again the enemy of the enemy is my friend. And even if we don't share your ideology, we don't care what your ideology is if you're going to kill the communists.
Right. Yeah. I didn't. Just to be clear, I didn't mean to demean pagan religions in any way. Yeah, but I was trying to get to. I guess it's really more like a Native American in the United States, a more earth-centered religion, ideology, and but as you describe, being demonized because it is not Christ-centered, I guess. Even though Morales was a Christian, it's just a way to demonize it, turn it into anything that's not Christian is, satanic or whatever.
Exactly.
And in the same way they demonize Muslim religions and so on, just to, if not gain support among Americans and Western societies, to have them not care too much about it. At the very least, and it's like maybe they don't go along with the demonization, but they don't feel the need to have a brotherly defense of those people because they're so different and non-Christian and so on. It's just it's terrible. And I didn't.
One quick note, if I could jump in
it.
for a second.
Yeah,
There's
sure.
actually a hilarious, incredible moment a few years ago. People might remember. Evo Morales met the Pope Francis, and he gave him a crucifix with Jesus, but it was shaped as a hammer and sickle.
Whoa! What?
Yeah. So he very much was inspired by liberation theology, and Evo made a conscious attempt to kind of combine the liberation theology tradition of Latin America with these more indigenous traditions.
Right. Well, I need to let you go, but I tell you, I mentioned to my partner a lot of the times, I say, when we talk about all of the factional wars going on here, the whole Russiagate thing and all of that, I say to him, sometimes I think this boils down to, it's obviously control of the natural resources and things like that, but it's almost like who's fighting over control over the trafficking routes too. Like that's certainly embedded in all of this, and that's a rabbit hole that we can't go down. But here's another example of that. It must be a very, very lucrative business to be on the if your side, controls it. And anyway, I'll just throw that little bit in there. But Ben, thank you so much for all this work that you've done, and for the time that you've spent. I mean, you haven't just done your research. You've actually gone down there. You've spent time there. You've really gone all out, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Please take whatever time you like to wrap up and let everybody know. I think they already do know, but make sure that they know where to find you, how to support your work, and all of that.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on, and the work you do is incredible too. So it's mutual admiration. The last thing I'll say, I have to mention it before concluding here, is that, we were talking about how awful the coup is and how it's a major step back for Bolivia and the region, and the attempt by these right-wing elites and oligarchs to reestablish control. But of course, we have to mention there has been a massive resistance movement. So although the prospects do look pretty bleak, there is a massive uprising going on, and the future is still up in the air. And even if, these resistance forces that are in the street, even if they can't manage to defeat this military coup backed by the U.S. empire and by regional countries like Brazil, which is the largest country in Latin America, still, the movement towards socialism and the social movements that Evo Morales come from, these forces aren't going to be defeated. So we'll see what happens in Bolivia. But I do think that although in the short term the situation is quite bad, I think in the long term I still, from the people I've been talking to, my sources and friends and comrades in Bolivia, I think people their spirit hasn't been broken. And then finally, I'll just say for anyone who wants to, follow the kind of work we've been doing on this and some of our other colleagues, I mentioned Jeb Sprague's work at the Grayzone. You can find our reporting at thegrayzone.com, and that is Gray, American spelling, thegrayzone.com. And you all should, support their work, support Joanne's work as well, because this is a great podcast. I've had the pleasure of being on before to talk about the war in Yemen, so she covers a lot of great topics that are ignored by mainstream media. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Ben Norton. Follow him on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. Find his work at the Grayzone. Subscribe to their YouTube channel. And support them on Patreon. Patreon.com/Grayzone. Grayzone. Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and your support's really important. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or paypal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. You can find this podcast on all mobile podcast apps or on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/AroundTheEmpire. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.